Well, I think we're mostly here, and as is our custom, we not only start on time, but we'll start 1 minute ahead of time and get going. I'm George Shultz here at Hoover, and I'm joined by my colleagues Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, and Jim Goodby, former ambassador, Sid Drell, you should see the other guy, Sid is a special guy in all this because he's a real physicist. He really understands a nuclear weapon fully, and David Holloway. And we have all participated in a conference on deterrence, both here at Hoover and then a subsequent one at London. And the books that have been distributed contain the papers and some of the discussion and the speeches by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, and by Henry Kissinger and others, and an op-ed that we wrote on the subject of deterrence. And all the papers from the conference are in these books. So what we thought we'd do here this afternoon is I'll make some comments about the subject. I'll ask Bill too, and then Sid and Jim and David. And then if any one of us wants to get in an argument with the other, we can. But we'd rather just have some questions and discussion with you. So let me say that, first of all, deterrence is a very comfortable concept. The idea is that you put yourself in a position, rather passively, such that somebody who might want to do something to you feels that they better not do it. So you deter them. I remember when I became Secretary of the Treasury, the head of the Internal Revenue Service came and told me about the fact that we have the most wonderful voluntary tax system in the world. I said, really, it's voluntary? Yeah, he said, of course, everybody knows that somebody may be watching. It's deterrence, and that works. But what has happened since the invention of nuclear weapons in the conflict arena, that nuclear weapons have sort of taken over the concept. And to a certain extent, I think one of the things we need to do is pull that away so that we can talk sensibly about other ways of deterring. Because if you're going to deter, your deterrent has to be effective and credible. Now, if you think back into the Cold War period, first of all, Stalin must have made a calculation that he could unleash the North Koreans to invade the South, and there would be no deterrent from the nuclear weapons. So it didn't deter him, and it didn't deter us from reacting. And so we had the Korean War. It was not deterred. You remember the Hungarian uprising in 1956 that was crushed mercilessly by the Soviets. They were not deterred from doing that, or the same thing in Prague Spring, or for creating the conditions that necessitated the Berlin airlift, or the invasion of Afghanistan. So we saw that the deterrent capability of nuclear weapons, well, you could say it deterred a nuclear exchange. But some of us think that it would be easier to deter a nuclear exchange by just not having them in the first place. But we struggle to find just what it is that nuclear weapons deter. And of course, it's really important, as I said, they be critical. I remember vividly when I was in Marine Corps boot camp right at the start of World War II, and the drill sergeant hands me my rifle, and he says, take good care of this is your best friend. And remember, never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. In other words, he's saying, when the Marine doctrine should be, the deterrent of pointing the rifle is real. You will pull the trigger. If somebody believes you won't pull the trigger, it's not a deterrent. So this is the struggle I think we face with nuclear weapons, and particularly with the end of the Cold War. And you ask yourself, what are the threats that we face? And certainly the terrorist threat is prominent among those. And you say, what is a nuclear weapon? Were they on the mind of Osama bin Laden? Yes, he wanted to get one. But as far as deterrent capability, it just wasn't there. So we've tried to explore this issue with some care, because as you know, we have been examining the road toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And deterrence is sort of the doctrinal side of the coin, and nuclear weapons on the other side of the coin. So our conference explored all those issues in some detail, but it's an important issue. And Bill, maybe you'd make some comments on it.
Well, the kind of deterrence we had during the Cold War was a very special kind. It was called Mutual Assured Deterrence, which had the very appropriate acronym of MAD. The good news about MAD is that it worked in the sense that George just described. Namely, it prevented a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. It didn't do much of anything else, but that was a very big thing, and it did that. The bad news about it is that it almost didn't. That is, we came very close, 3 or 4 different occasions, to a nuclear exchange in spite of having MAD. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we almost had a nuclear war by miscalculation. And there were at least 3 times in the United States when we almost had a nuclear exchange by accident with false alarms. So MAD did work.
You ought to tell them about the time you got awakened in the middle of the night.
Well, I will, since you asked me. This is emblazoned in my memory because when I was the Undersecretary of Defense, I was awoken about 3 o'clock in the morning by a call from a general of the North American Air Defense Command, who started off the conversation by telling me my computers are showing 200 missiles on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. Believe me, that woke me up in a hurry. Now, he had already concluded that this was a false alarm and was calling me. I was the technical guy in the Defense Department, to figure out what the hell had happened and what had gone wrong with his computer. So he had a good answer when he talked to the president the next morning. But that was one of 3 false alarms I know of in the United States. I have to believe there were a number of false alarms in the Soviet Union too. So there were numerous opportunities for having a nuclear exchange by accident. But we did not, as much by good luck as by good management. Today, the Cold War is over, but what is our strategy today? It is still MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. And for whatever benefits that has, one has to raise the question, why, with the Cold War gone, do we still have to take the dangers and the risks that are associated with mutual assured destruction? Isn't there a different or better way of doing it? I would point out that we do not have a MAD policy with the United Kingdom. We're not mad at the United Kingdom. We're not mad at France. They have nuclear weapons, but we do not feel the need to have that kind of a policy. What is the difference between our policy to the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia? Obviously, it is because there is a complete lack of trust and confidence between the United States and Russia, which does not exist between the United States and the United Kingdom. So if we want to get out of this conundrum we're in now, if we want to find a way of getting rid of the dangers associated with MAD, we need to find a way of building trust and confidence with the nations with whom we now have a MAD policy. But there's a problem here. How do you build trust with somebody who is pointing a loaded gun at your head? That's a way of describing our MAD situation, where each of them standing there pointing a loaded gun at each other's head. So we need to find a way of building trust in the face of this action, which engenders mistrust. And it's not going to be easy. I believe we can do it, but I think it's going to be difficult and a step at a time. A step at a time. Maybe the first thing to do is put the guns back in the holster, say. And then maybe put a safety on the gun. And then maybe take the bullets out of the gun and set them on the table beside you. The whole set of things you can do to help this problem some. But the more general problem is the one of building trust and confidence. David Holloway and I were at a conference in Brussels last week with some Russian colleagues, focused on a particular issue: is can the U.S. and Russia cooperate in the field of ballistic missile defense? I trust David's going to be talking something about that today. I'm not going to say anything more about it, hoping that David will cover that subject. But it's just one example of one step that could be taken to build trust and confidence. And one step at a time, one action at a time, we start to move away from this posture of mad. I would just leave you with 2 points. First of all, the mad posture we have with Russia today is dangerous, is as dangerous as it was during the Cold War. And we should not have to live with that danger. And the second is that it's going to be difficult to back away from it because of this problem I described of two people pointing guns at each other. It's hard to build the trust and confidence while they're bringing the guns down.
Thank you, Bill. Sid?
This is evidence that I believe in deterrence. In fact, in my case, I lost the negotiation with an irregularity in the sidewalk. But deterrence in the past meant negotiate, try and figure out how to resolve your differences without going to war. And it was, to be successful, backed by strength. Defensive strength, which said to the enemy, should he attack, you're pretty good at defending yourself and protecting yourself, something you can't do with nuclear weapons anymore. And with offensive strength, namely that you might do something harmful to him and he wouldn't do it. But that was the deterrence before it was taken over by nuclear weapons. It was captured by nuclear weapons, as George said. And we reached a point where the bombs were not only as bad as the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were 1,000 times more destructive than the biggest bomb in World War II. They were shortly supplanted by the thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb, which those bombs were just the trigger, and they were another 100 to 1,000 times even more destructive. And as President Eisenhower said in 1958, war is reaching a point where it's no longer possible because it's no longer exhaustion of the enemy and surrender, it's destruction of the enemy and suicide. And so that's what we're facing with MAD and with these weapons. And as Bill emphasized, to get anywhere, one's going to have to build trust, confidence, and dealing with the people we're living with who have different ideas than we do. And the questions then become, how do we make the conditions possible that we would have a stable world if we got rid of the nuclear weapons? That's a practical question. I mean, there are the very difficult dimensions of it, namely how do you get regional stability, make a stable world or a peaceful world where countries are willing to entertain this idea. But it's more than that. They have to believe that if we were to go all the way to zero, there is an ending there, a vision there that makes sense, that we could have a stable world if our political system accommodated it. Now, the steps, no matter what else we say, that has been the heart of the work on this project, as George said, for the 5 years we've been at it. The steps, one by one, to create conditions that will mean that this vision makes sense. The vision can inspire the steps, but the steps, it means nothing without the steps. And we have gone through that in our previous publications, and the summary of them are in this particular book. But now we're going to ask ourselves, how well do we understand the conditions of zero nuclear weapons, and does it make sense? Now, it's very difficult. I'm not going to make it sound easy. It isn't, but in anything that makes you doubt, remember the alternative, proliferation, and what this world would be like if with terrorists, if with rogue states, if with more countries around the world, nuclear weapons are available and are deployed out there. So with that as a scale setting, we ask, what are the steps? I mean, how do you accomplish the steps, and do you believe the vision? Now, clearly, if you're going to get down towards zero, you must have extensive cooperation and trust in the countries you're dealing with. And you say, can that ever be? Well, let me remind you that 25 years ago, before the Soviet Union collapsed into the dustbin of history, there was absolutely no element of trust. But again, realizing the dangers of the situation, we did move out of that once the Soviet Union was lost and the Russian Federation came into being. And if you look at what has been accomplished in terms of trust and transparency in the last 25 years, it is breathtaking. We had a START treaty, a Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty from the Reagan administration with the vision of the Secretary of State and others there at that time.
Back in those days, we said trust, but verify.
Trust but verify. And in that spirit, means of verification were established. It may sound strange if you think of it, more than 1,100 or so on-site inspections were carried out under the START treaty during the years it was in being. That's fantastic. And now we have the new START treaty, with which we can even count deployed warheads as well as missiles. And there have been more than 1,000 exchanges of information in its short life. So when you think of how much progress has been made, why rule out the fact that a comparable progress can be made on some time scale depending upon how hard we work at it? That is the kind of thing one looks at. What kind of verification do you need? And then as you get down very much close to zero, if you get down very close to zero, how do you handle the fact that, assuming that the trust is developed to the point that we can get there and we know the locations and they're open for inspection, and the disarmament or the separation of missiles, at least into components, has been completed. How do you have a stable condition? Because it won't be pre-1945. We can't forget the knowledge that we've made and used nuclear weapons. We will know that. Therefore, we can reconstitute them. And so how do you develop a stable relation where you have to worry about someone deciding, well, I'm going to break out of this? How do you handle breakout? The intelligence you need, and how do you get early warning of it? And that, again, is part of the problem, which will evolve as our trust grows to the point where we can say the number has gotten very close to zero. What kind of infrastructure do you need that would allow you to rebuild weapons? There will be countries that never built them, but we will know how to rebuild them. In fact, we will have an infrastructure, because while we're going down, we still have to maintain the safety and the security of the ones we have. And so it is a problem of whether we converge to something sensible, and we feel that there's a concept of stability based upon having early warning of attempts of breakout, protection of the infrastructure, limits on the infrastructure, transparency and cooperation. We attack these problems in this book. We don't solve them. We talk about things. We're still working the problem. What do you need by verification? How much trust? How do you gain that trust? It's a challenge, because the alternative is living eternally under a nuclear sword of Damocles, which I think has all the bad features about it that you've heard. And that's what we're working on, and that's where we make strides in this book explaining how far we've come.